Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Debashri Dattare, Assistant Professor in Comparative Literature at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. Today, I shall be speaking about the EPG English Paper 11, Reading New Literatures in English. My specific module is Indigenous Peoples' Writings and the New Literatures in English. Indigenous definitions are most important. We would be talking about indigenous definitions. We would be talking about the implications of the word indigeneity. We would take Northeast India as a specific case study and look into some writers from that region. We would also look into one Adivasi text, an Adivasi writer, who has made a significant contribution to the world of indigeneity. So, we begin with indigenous definitions. Recognized as Aborigines in Australia, as Maori in New Zealand, as First Nations in Canada, as Indigenous in the United Nations, as Janajatis in India, or as tribes in anthropology, as notified communities in the administrative parlance of many countries, as indigenous people in the discourse of human rights, and as Adivasis in the terminology of Asian activists, these variously described communities are far too numerous and dispersed in geographical locations to admit of a single inclusive description. This was said by Ganesh Devi, and this was very significant in terms of our understanding of how to define the indigenous. In the field of indigenous studies, what are our concerns? Organizations such as ILO, UNESCO use the term indigenous to represent over 1,000 different communities across the world. Indigenous studies today has been going on with much emphasis across the world, and it is helping us to initiate cross-disciplinary records and studies and readings on a wide range of areas related to indigenous peoples and their rights. It is possible to forge connections by being sensitive to specific historical and discursive indigenous practices, which in turn would lead to a different understanding in reading, writing, and foregrounding indigenous knowledge practices. One of the most important books that anybody who begins indigenous studies should read is a text by Linda Tuhiwai Smith. She is a Maori writer and a Maori activist working at the University of Auckland, and her book is called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People. This is one of the most important books in the field, published in 1999 and then republished and brought out as a second edition in 2012. The Indigenous Agenda. What is the Indigenous Agenda today? 1. To recover lived experiences and understand rootedness and fear of displacement. 2. To enhance the indigenous voice and influence in society. 3. To develop alternate ways of understanding the world through indigenous experiences. Now let us go on to the Northeast India. Northeast of India has been prone to certain perceptions. We shall deal with these perceptions one by one. One of the most important perceptions brought out by Patricia Mukim in the text Where is this Northeast is as below. She writes, a landmass with a geographical area of 2.55 lakh square kilometers, which is a mere 7% of the country's total area. This region shares only 2% of its boundary with India, while the remaining 98% is bordered by the countries of Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Nepal, and China. in terms of their physical features, ethnicity, culture, food habits, and language. There is a close affinity with the people of Southeast Asia than the population of mainstream India. Therefore, the similarities is more with Southeast Asia, which tends to alienate them more with the mainstream India. The second perception is voiced by Shonjib Borua in a text which he calls Protective Discrimination and Crisis of Citizenship. He writes, Northeast India is a region where the politics of protective discrimination for scheduled tribes, STs, today raises some of the most difficult issues of justice, fairness, and course on system legitimacy. He speaks in terms of politics, he speaks in terms of recent turmoils in the northeast of India. The next perception comes from Kailash C. Boral, who writes in his essay Articulating Marginality, Emerging Literatures from the Northeast India. This is a very seminal essay in a book edited by Margaret Sizama from a Mizo academician. It's called Emerging Literatures from Northeast India, The Dynamics of Culture, Society, and Identity. Professor Boral writes, Northeast in many ways is a land of paradoxes. In the congeries of its complexities and contradictions, Northeast is not only a territory of diverse people and cultures, but also an idea constantly evolving in its making. If the past has a rootedness in harmony among communities and cultures, the present is a reality of profound disaffection. The violence that stalks the land is part of everyday life that adds to the fragility of the human condition. In spite of all this, life goes on. Kailash Boral speaks about the fragility of human conditions and human life in the Northeast. Northeast is a land of paradoxes, of gun-toting militants, of insurgencies, of vast landscapes, of beautiful people and beautiful creativity. We shall talk about it in the next few slides. So what do writers from the Northeast do? One, they articulate marginality and build a literary paradigm for a Northeast discourse. Two, they negotiate the challenge of representing the past from the unspoken but inexorable reality of the present. They contest established hierarchies and attempt revisioning of aesthetic theory. Locating trauma, the politics of tradition and continuity, the ecological space, the authors offer culture as a site of struggle and also account for the cultural changes in the Northeast. One of the most important writers from the Northeast is Mamang Dai. Mamang Dai is from Arunachal Pradesh, born in the East Siang district in 1957 and was formerly a civil servant. Currently a journalist and a writer from the Adi community in Arunachal Pradesh. She is the founder of the Arunachal Historical Society. She has written extensively on the cultural history of Arunachal Pradesh and is also member of the Northeast Writers Forum. Her established works include Arunachal Pradesh, The Hidden Land, River Poems, and other such, and the Legends of Pensam, which is very seminal in terms of indigenous communities. One of the poems by Mamang Dai is Voice of the Mountain. This is a poem which begins in this way. The other day, a young man arrived from the village. Because he could not speak, he bought a gift of fish. From the land of rivers, it seems that such acts are repeated. Mamang Dai offers land as a source of sustenance, as a source of inspiration. The separation from land by indigenous people has been an historical truth, and it will continue to be a historical truth which one needs to reiterate in order to account for the tales of devastation and deprivation of many indigenous people. The next author that we need to talk about is Temsula Au. Temsula Au is from Nagaland. She's a writer, a versatile poet, an academician, a storyteller, and is one of the most prominent contemporary authors from the northeast of India, who reconfigures the structural boundaries of literary genres in her work. A retired professor at the Department of English and the former dean of the School of Humanities and Education, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, Temsula Au is the author of several volumes of poetries, 2 volumes of short stories, and has also written a book called the Ao Naga Oral Tradition, which was published by Bhasha in 1999. And this was also known as one of the most important 100 books ever published in that century. She experiments with multiple genres: fiction, poetry, historical narrative, and memoir within a single work. One of her poems, The Old Storyteller, is a powerful weapon of subversion. The poem begins, "So I told stories as my racial responsibility to instill in the young the art of perpetuating existential history and essential tradition to be passed on to the next generations." For her, storytelling is empowering, and therefore it shapes her reality today. Language becomes a metaphor for potential change. One of her most important books and her first collection of stories is called These Hills Called Home, Stories from a War Zone. It speaks of a turbulent Nagaland where you've had AFSPA in 1958, which continues today. It speaks of insurgency. It speaks about common people who are affected by it. One of the stories, which is probably one of the most powerful stories in the collection, is called The Last Song, where this young Naga girl, Apenyo, beautiful and a wonderful singer, is raped and killed by a young army captain and his men inside a church, which is razed to the ground. This becomes one of the most powerful stories ever told, and it reiterates the reality that is Nagaland. Another important writer from Nagaland is Isteren Kire Eralo. She has written several books in English, including 3 collections of poetry and short stories. Her first novel, A Naga Village Remembered, was the first ever Naga novel to be published. Has translated over 200 oral poems from her native language, Tenildi, into English. She is founder and partner in a publishing house, Bark Weaver, which gathers and publishes Naga folk tales. The story about A Naga Village Remembered speaks about Kohima, speaks about war, speaks about pre-contact, post-contact indigenous identity within mainstream India. And it is through her writings that she hopes to bring in an increased sense of a people which goes beyond gun culture. She wants to speak of rootedness to Nagaland. The next person on our syllabus and the next person who needs to be noted is a poet from Imphal, Manipur. Studied literature at St. Edmund's College in the Northeastern Hill University, Nehu, and where he now teaches literature. Robin S. Ngangom. A prolific poet who writes in English and Manipuri, Robin describes his poetry as mostly autobiographical, written with the hope of enthusing readers with my communal or carnal life, the life of a politically discriminated against, historically overlooked individual from the nook of a third world country. His major works include The Desire of Roots, Time's Crossroads, and Words and the Silence. And along with this, he has also edited one of the most seminal volumes in Northeast India, an anthology of contemporary poetry from the Northeast, along with Khasi poet Kinpham Singh Nongking Ri. One of the poems by Robin S. Ngangom is called My Invented Land. It goes on, and these are excerpts from the poem. My home is a gun pressed against both temples, a knock over a night that has not ended, a torch lit long after the theft, a sonnet about body counts, undoubtedly raped, definitely abandoned in a tryst with destiny. The poem projects the notion of home, distorted by turbulent histories of discrimination and torture in Manipur. The notion of a coercive identity that marks the common man's existence with the geographical space of Manipur concerns the poet. The next poet that we need to talk about is Kimphang Singh Nongkere, who writes in Khasi and in English. He is also the Deputy Director of Publications at the Northeastern Hill University in Shillong. He edits the university newsletter Nehu News in the university and the official journal, and he's also brought out the first poetry journal in Khasi, Rilum. He was awarded a fellowship for Outstanding Artist 2000 from the Government of India, as well as 3 bursaries for Khasi texts from the Government of Meghalaya. He has received the Northeast Poetry Award in 2004 and the Northeast India Poetry Council from the Northeast India Poetry Council, Tripura. His major works include Moments, Sieve, and he has also, as we just spoke about, co-edited contemporary poetry from the Northeast with Manipuri poet Robin S. Namong. His poems deals with myths, it deals with legends, it deals with stories. Nongkere has this poem called The Ancient Rocks of Chera, which deals with the serpent's death it speaks about Chera mythology, it speaks about certain myths invested in Khasi folklore. For this poet, it is most crucial that one understands the inscription of the oral into the written, and he works accordingly in his poetry. Artist in our panorama is Esther CM. Esther CM teaches English literature at the Northeastern Hill University at Shillong and has been working on folk and oral literatures for a long time. She writes also in Khasi and English. Some of her works are Oral Scriptings, a poetry collection, Kanam, a Khasi play, Of Follies and Frailties of Wit and Wisdom, a poetry collection, and also the Oral Discourse in Khasi folk narrative. To the Rest of India from Another Indian is a poem by Esther CM. She writes, "We have no Rama, no Sita, no Arjuna, ours are differently named." Goes on, "No one river too sacred to purify impurities, none of her gods bear god names like yours." Then she tells us that it is possible to think of India in multiplicity, in its plurality, to think of an India which needs to include the Northeast. And she goes on, "But if you should twist your tongue around ours, if you learn to twist ours around yours, you will get a taste of webbed legends." The poem focuses upon the notions of imposed difference and problematizes the idea of self and other within the discourse of the nation. Sherry L. Shangte is a young poet from Mizoram. Educated in Shillong, she received her PhD from Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. A lecturer in English at Mizoram University, Shangte is a prolific poet from the younger generation of literatus from Northeast India. In a poem entitled Plea, she displays the prolific powers of complete rejection of imposed labels as follows. "Demytholize me, I would rather be a person than a representative of my tribe. Individualistic and selfish with personal quirks, but also personal needs." Shangte foregrounds the effects of a systemic discrimination and rejects stereotypical representations. She asserts her right to an identity of her choice. Disorient yourself, discard the prejudices and assumptions, dealing the past from the present, the legacy of customs, tradition, and learning. I would rather be a temporal reality than an intangible wisp of memory. This is one of Shangte's most important poems and very crucial to our understanding of Northeast history and Northeast literary stories. However, we have also had writers beyond the Northeast. One such writer is Hansa Sobendra Shekhar. He's a medical officer with the government of Jharkhand. His stories and articles have been published in Indian literature, The Statesman, The Asian Age, and other such journals and magazines, including the Times of India. He is the author of a collection of short stories entitled The Adivasi Will Not Dance, and also a novel, The Mysterious Ailment of Rupi Baski. He received the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2015. The Adivasi Will Not Dance is a prolific collection of short stories by Shekhar. It has stories which deal with the socio-political realities of Adivasis in Jharkhand in particular, but which is true for many indigenous communities across India. Troop Master Mangal Murmu's refusal to perform for the President of India and to be beaten down reflects on the limitations of agency permitted to the Adivasi. The elderly Pamuni and Biran Soren moved to Vadodara only to find out they must stop eating meat to be accepted as citizens. Taimai Kisku of the Shantal Pargana is a migrant worker in Bengal who is compelled to sleep with a policeman for 50 rupees and 2 cold bread pakoras. So this is a story of indigenous communities and how their lives are lived experiences are part of their literature and frame our understanding of literary aesthetics today. In conclusion, we can say that the indigenous writer seeks to speak for herself, himself, irrespective of stereotypical renditions in popular culture and histories. Indigenous criticism demands that the process of colonization, new imperialism, and its far-reaching impacts in the past to the present day be interrogated and explored by indigenous peoples themselves. They have been engaged in dialogues which seek self-determination, embodied in a desire to articulate literary theories and practices from an indigenous perspective. We have looked into writers from Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Meghalaya. We have looked into oral traditions and the ability to understand them within the paradigms of literary theory and criticism today. We have looked into how indigenous theories have shaped understanding of indigenous aesthetics and indigenous studies. We have also looked into the Adivasi writer Shekhar and his contribution to the community. This is how these papers or these texts deal with indigenous new literatures in English. Thank you very much.